asking, can crit be used for ESL students who are struggling readers?
The answer is yes, and yes in thunder. What we found both in our own classes at UT Austin, where I think people assume that everybody is, completely proficient. If you got into UT Austin, it's a really good school. We still have students who are struggling with some primary language translation. And this is something where we get a lot of individual responses from students saying, this really helped me because it forced me to slow down and see. Now, one problem I will say, so this is not just a complete infomercial for crit. One problem with this is it's great if you do this on, as we discussed, between 50 and 250 words. But if one is assigning a long text to a student who is struggling to translate and learn a language in the process, that slowness and that hardness is going to be a drawback because they will probably feel overwhelmed. But again, we think that the process of crit can be really helpful for ESL students because it starts at a small, manageable amount of text and then builds from there. So you can't, and no one would, but you can't say to a student, well, just close read the entire novel or the entire short story. But the skills that they can pick up there, maybe around idioms or around specific sort of phrases that they struggle with, will probably pay off in their comprehension of the text as a whole. Great question.
Great. A question from Donald Worsham. How well does this work in the middle school classroom along with notice and note?
It's a great question. And it's a great question because, again, we're thinking about adaptability. We're thinking about connections across, again, not just K to 12, but into the higher. What I will say is if you are using another technique, or in that case, notice and note are great sort of, I think all of that is really describing practices that are going by a different name, but are deeply sympathetic. So we've chosen these steps and we've named them for very specific reasons. But all we think you would have to do, as it were to follow up on an ESL question, is translate. So when you're sort of, noticing and note, or there are a lot of other, I'm not competing, but there are a lot of other approaches to interpretation that describe things in slightly different language. Again, for your classrooms, just try to find something that, as it were, rhymes with the terminology you're using and are comfortable with. And if you have to rename our steps to make them connect more elegantly with what your students used to, by all means, do it. Some people don't like that this step 4 is called analyze. So because we're doing analysis through really all 6 steps, that's fine. Find a different way to describe it. Or if you're working at a middle school level and one is sort of, as it were, ratchet down some of the language in the steps, by all means, do it. Again, whatever is useful in your classrooms, but they're not mutually exclusive at all. And because we're talking about things like observe, a fundamental skill, not just in literary interpretation, but in any act of meaning making, of producing knowledge, we start by observing. And so, of course, you're going to find connections to things like noticing and noting. I think that's really helpful. Annotation is really important here. In some ways, we assume this, but getting students to use pencils or to use computers or whatever adaptive technologies they have to be able to have a fundamentally creative and critical relationship with the text, which is to say, to get the students to be able to own the text, feel like they can talk back to it, have some marginalia, have some not just noting and noticing and noting, but really sort of like making the text something that they have a different, more original relationship to.
Wonderful. And then somewhat similar, Cynthia Brewer would like to ask, would you recommend that crit could be scaffolded for students with learning disabilities, language disability, dyslexia, reading difficulties?
So yes, the answer is yes. But again, and I think that verb is so important, they're scaffolded. And really, I think what would be helpful, maybe thinking next generation or where we'll take this next, we've had good anecdotal evidence of people doing exactly that. But I really think at some point, and maybe look forward to doing some of this work myself, that sort of work would really benefit from some collaboration between those of us that developed this and folks working in a sort of, folks with disabilities, with dyslexia, reading difficulties, again, ESL, all of those are opportunities, I think, for us to further tweak what we've done or what we're proposing and what would be most helpful for y'all. But yeah, I do think, again, because we're trying to articulate a model, a method here that once it's articulated, we hope that y'all will be able to adjust it to your classrooms and to the needs of your individual students. So I hope in the years to come, we can find a way to really build those collaborations and maybe in a form that will be more, will affect the whole thing of crit, but also will make crit, again, more accessible in every sense of that word.
What ideas or approaches have you seen that help students make sense of or get buy-in with close reading, i.e. battling the when will I ever use this again question and connecting it to their lives?
Awesome, 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 Patty. A fundamental question that I think we answer every day in our classrooms, or we fear answer every day in our classrooms, as is the case with me. Not just is this going to be on the test, but when am I ever going to use this again? And especially since a lot of this was developed in a classroom where we're looking at online 1,000, 1,200 students a semester, in person a mere 300 or 400. Looking at a lecture hall full of students, much less a lecture hall full of Zoom boxes, nothing will make you feel less secure in your own pedagogy than that question of like, are they even listening? Or do they understand that what I'm offering them is not just about a poem that they'll never read again or a piece of fiction they really don't care about? And so what we do, and we really believe this, is make the case for, even if you're an engineer, especially if you're an engineer, the skill we're teaching here, that sort of critical thinking and critical reading, will absolutely pay off later when you have to read an instruction for a bid for a major multi-million-dollar project. When you're a nursing student and are not just trying to make sense of something quickly, a doctor's orders or a prescription, but trying to make sense of some hospitalese, something that pertains very much to your work on the ward. We can make the argument that this ability to observe, to contextualize, to argue, all of those things are absolutely relatable to other things in life. Now, we're backed up because the University of Texas and the state of Texas requires this literature class in order to graduate. So we can kind of stand behind that and say, well, they must be doing it for a reason, not just because they hate you and like poetry. The state of Texas is doing this because, again, it's a fundamental and portable skill, something we think can go everywhere. So I just add that to every time I teach, even to the converted, even to my English majors. I make this case passionately that learning to close read, whether through crit or something else, can absolutely pay off, not just in this class and other classes, but for the rest of your life. Or if I know we're running a little bit.
We've got time for one more question, I think, a shorter one. Quick one, is this something that you would grade, or is it intended to be more low stakes?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes to both. So in my classes, in my non-major classes, crits of some sort make up between 50 and 60% of the grade. So in some ways, this is replacing my essay writing for non-majors. But we also do these as practices, both in my non-major classes and in my major classes. And so that ends up being a lower stake. I will say for the lower stake, what I tend to do, we think a good crit should probably take a student, and this is really hard, individual students, but generally less than an hour to do a close reading via crit. But that's a big investment. And if it's not graded, that's asking a lot of students to go spend an hour either in the class or out of the class and not having it count. As the old adage from pedagogical theory goes, if it counts, it counts. If it's going to involve, it's important to the class, we might as well grade it. And yet we've also found great success for making it low stakes and sort of complete incomplete by going with the multimodal sort of stepped process. That is being able to say, okay, tonight you're just going to do observations or a paraphrase for this poem. And that's going to be a check or check plus or no check at all. And we found that to be really successful, again, because it gets the students to start to feel proficiency with all the steps. It also means it's a much smaller bit of homework or in-class work. You can do a paraphrase, as we'll see very shortly in just a couple minutes.
Okay, great. That is all the time we have